Maybe they have too many limbs. Maybe they resemble something straight from folklore. Maybe they're a little too hungry for humans. Today's episode features allegedly real-life encounters with disturbing creatures that simply should not exist. What's the scariest creature you've ever seen? Enjoy, and if you have a scary story of your own about the unexplained, share it with me at darkstories.org so I can narrate it. Also, check out eeriecast.com for more scary podcasts. Now, let's begin. The Tall Man. From Anonymous. I'm a 19-year-old college student. I live about 25 to 30 minutes out past any city limits or other houses. It takes me around 45 minutes to get to class every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I usually don't get home until late, like after 10 or 10:30 p.m. when I do have class. I live in a little cottage-style home with one other person. One night, I was awakened by a loud thud. When I first heard it, I thought it was my roommate, until I remembered I was supposed to be home alone that night. I grabbed my pocket knife that I kept by my bed and my phone. I tried to be as quiet as I could getting out of bed, but my house was old and it creaked a lot. I walked to the door as slow as possible, so I wouldn't be too loud. Once I got to the door and went to open it, I caught a glimpse of what looked to be another person. I thought it was my mind making shapes out of nothing, but when I realized it was actually there, I turned around and ran back to my room as quickly as I could. When I made it to my room, I locked the door and called the police as quickly as possible. It took the police around 45 minutes to an hour to get there. The operator stayed on the phone with me the whole time. While I waited, I began to hear a bone-chilling scream coming from my kitchen, followed by the loudest footsteps I've ever heard. It felt like forever, sitting in my bed, waiting for help to arrive. Finally, I saw the blue lights come by my window and 4 to 5 shadows outside. I opened the bedroom door and raced to the front door to open it. Once I opened the front door, I just fell into the officer's arms. The police looked around the area, searching for any trespassers. They told me they didn't find anything suspicious though, except a few weird-looking prints around one of the windows and some mud prints inside. When the cops were done and they left, I left too. I went into town and I stayed at a friend's house for the night. The next morning, my dad, my roommate, and I went back to my place to check it out. Once we got there, I saw this weird-looking engraving on all the window sills. The engraving looked to be a smiley face that someone just carved in with a knife, or something else just as sharp. Once we got to the prints I saw, it looked more like really big feet than shoe prints. The weird thing about it, though, was that they only seemed to have 3 toes, and they were double if not triple the size of my dad's foot, and he wore a size 13. I stayed with my parents for a few nights, just in case. Once I was brave enough to go back to my house, I found more prints around my place, and there was a rotting carcass left on my front porch. The poor thing was an elk, and someone had carved a smiley face into it. My roommate and I put the house on the market that day, but I didn't know if it would sell because it needed a bit of work done to it. Around 2 weeks went by with no encounter to whatever this thing was. The house was soon to be sold to an older couple and their dog. The final night we stayed there, my roommate and I were all packed already, so we both came to the conclusion that we'd both sleep on an air mattress together that night, so we wouldn't have much of a mess to clean afterward. We slept in her room that night, which was closest to the front door and had a bench window in it. We fell asleep around 12 a.m. after watching a movie. At about 2:30 a.m., my roommate woke me up. She asked in a whisper, "Did you hear that noise?" I didn't hear anything at the time, but a few seconds later, I did hear something. There was a very loud noise that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Whatever was making the noise seemed to be right outside the window. My roommate got up to lock the bedroom door, but before she could, the front door creaked open. I started shaking really rapidly, and my roommate locked the door and called the cops. It was very quiet, and we were waiting for the police to arrive. We heard our intruder walking over to our door. A thud, thud, thud on the other side of the door on the old wood flooring. Once it got to the door, it began to scratch and scream at the door and walls. About 25 minutes later, it got in through the door, and we saw it before us. A tall, slim, pale figure appeared from the shadows. It was about 7 or 8 feet tall, with a huge smile on its face and long arms. They weren't just long, though, they were touching the floor. I gulped in and took a deep breath. I was ready for the worst. The thing began to walk to me and my roommate, but it was more of a slide than a walk. It seemed to be dragging its feet, but not too fast, so it was taking a while for it to get to us. Right when this thing was about 5 feet from me and my roommate, the blue lights of the police cruisers came flooding through the window. The thing turned really quick and ran out of the door, if you could call it running. It was inhumanly quick, not like a sprint, but also not like an animal running. It was faster. The police rushed inside to get us. They placed us in a car for safety while they checked the area. Once they scanned the area, they let us know that the footprints were back. Now there were also scratch marks on the doorframe and the ground. Words had been etched there. They read, "Everyone needs to smile." We finally sold the house the following day. I heard nor saw nothing else about this thing. This was around 5 or 6 years ago, but I did have a nightmare not too long ago about it. I just can't seem to forget about these experiences. Something stared back. From Ceisan. This isn't a particularly eventful story, but it is true, and still gives me the creeps to this day. I've always loved the water, the ocean in particular. Even after some of the strange and creepy things I've encountered, it still holds a special place in my heart. When I was around 15, my mom and I took a cruise down through the Caribbean, stopping at all the well-known destinations along the coast of Mexico and some of the smaller Central American countries. Our last stop before heading back to port was a tiny island off the coast of Honduras. We had decided to book what was supposed to be a relaxing snorkeling excursion. Sure, it wasn't the most famous for underwater activities, but there are some absolutely gorgeous reefs in the area, and I wanted to be a marine biologist at the time, so it was like heaven for me. We took a small ferry out from the main port to the island we would be spending the day on, and after lunch I was straight off to the water. I remember it was strange that day. It was beautiful out, sure, but there was almost no one else in that water. I think there was only one other person when I first got in, and I seem to remember noticing they'd left at some point while I was out, leaving the reef all to myself. Nonetheless, the water was like a dream. Not too hot, not too cold, tall shelves of reddish coral swarming with tropical fish. I don't know how long I spent just floating around, but it must have been hours. I at least know I came out looking like a freshly cooked lobster by the end. Anyway, I was floating on my stomach, facing directly below me, trying to identify any of the fish I could see, meaning I wasn't paying attention to where I was going. Suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch, the water got cold, and in the same instant, I found I had kicked my way over the drop-off point. The reef ended, and I could see the rocky outcrop sliding down into the nothingness below me. This may not seem scary to those who have not experienced it, or anything like it, but suddenly finding yourself suspended above a seemingly bottomless void, it causes a kind of primal terror in you. I froze up, suddenly feeling incredibly small, out of place. The silence of the water in my ears was deafening. As I stared down into the abyss, I felt a strong sense of vertigo. And just as I was regaining my senses and the ability to move, I saw it. Something shifted in the murky darkness below me. Something big, impossibly big. The last thing I remember seeing was a massive eye opening up, looking directly at me. Then, the next thing I knew, I was back on shore trying desperately to explain what had happened to my probably tipsy mom. When I got to the part about seeing something in the water below me, my voice caught. I could tell she was only half listening as it was, and I didn't want to make myself sound crazy by reporting some giant sea creature only a few 100 feet out. I never told anyone that part of my story, and to this day, I still wonder what it was I could have seen. Maybe it was some whale or other large creature that had drifted closer than usual to the shore. I know it's a cliché, but I know it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. Whatever it was, I was never able to bring myself to look over the deck of the ship at night, too scared I'd see something watching me from the darkness again. Don't hunt alone in the Ozarks. From Thatdudesecond. Before we get into what happened, I'll give some background info. I grew up in the southern part of the Ozark Mountains, spending most of my free time working on the farm or hunting and trapping. Now, you occasionally see things or hear things you can't explain, but most things you can brush off as coyotes, or even the stray mountain lion. At the time of the first encounter, I was 16. It was a chillier November evening, and I was out hunting on my family's farm north of Hector, Arkansas. The spot I was hunting had an old logging road running down into the ravine, with a small hill behind me and a cliff face to my right. So darkness started to fall, and I finally got a deer with my muzzle loader. Anyone who has ever shot a muzzleloader can verify nothing ever hangs around after you shoot it. I instantly pulled out my phone to let the guys know I got one, when my arm hair began to rise. The deepest growl or yell bellowed from behind me as I pressed send. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Whatever it was on 2 legs, and it was coming closer, but there shouldn't have been anyone for another 2 hills. This creature began to sniff before growling again. Hastily, I reloaded the muzzleloader and shouted, "This is my farm. Leave or I'll shoot." It growled this time at the base of my tree. Darkness had enveloped the entire block of woods now. I was trapped with a flip phone and a muzzleloader against something that I couldn't see. I could only hope the other guys were on the way. Then I felt the ladder bending slightly, as if it was testing its weight. I pointed my flip phone light down, and I saw 2 red eyes clearly. However, the lights from my family's side-by-side lit up the hill, and the creature ran down into the ravine as Levi and the others pulled up. After a few months, some weird things happened in the area before it finally went quiet. Less than a week later, one of the locals went missing along with his dog in the same area. To my knowledge, he still has not been located. For the next 2 years, I never hunted that area again. Please, never hunt alone in the Ozarks, because what you can't see is more terrifying than what you can. Navajo Horse-Walker. From Sea Philly 100. I used to regularly go on these caravans from Denver down to Black Mesa. which is on the Navajo Nation in Arizona. We spent time on both the Hopi and Navajo reservations, working on building projects and herding sheep, and I've got to say, herding sheep on horseback is a truly amazing experience. I was also truly fortunate enough to attend a rain dance on the Hopi side out there on Second Mesa. Everyone was up on the rooftops watching the Kachina dancers do their thing down in the center square below. I was one of the only white people there. There were these particularly tough-looking Hopi guys walking around, which my friend said were dealers. After that, we went to my friend's mom's house and had some super delicious Hopi food before heading back to the Navajo Nation. It was dark by the time we got back to the Hogan, so my buddy and I took a little nature walk to meditate. We'd walked about 100 yards out into the desert night when we heard what sounded like a horse galloping towards us. There are wild horses down there, but we didn't want to get trampled, so we headed back to camp. We heard some coyotes off in the distance, so we figured the coyotes had just spooked some random horse. Well, we had just gotten back to camp when we heard a horse whinny nearby. Once again, we thought it was just that same horse, so we crawled into the tent and fell asleep. The next morning, we could see horse tracks all around our tent. "That's odd," I said. "Must be a real hungry horse," my friend smirked. Hungry Horse is a town in Montana, so it was kind of an inside joke with us. That day was normal enough. We worked on repairing an old Hogan and listened to NPR on the car radio while trying to keep the biting flies at bay. That night was a full moon night. Our group got together to cook some dinner, after which we began to eat. As it turns out, this is a big no-no in Navajo culture, as you're supposed to put together a small spirit plate and leave it out in the bush for the spirits to eat before you. We actually got chewed out by the community mentor, which put a sort of damper on things. Anyway, we wrapped up our dinner and decided to take another little nature walk before turning in for the night. We'd only gone about 50 yards before we heard that galloping sound again. This time we thought it might be cool to stick around to see this horse in question. Maybe it was lost. Maybe we'd get to see its markings to help locate the owner. Just then, we heard a loud snorting sound coming from some nearby piñon trees. We approached the piñon cautiously before stopping dead in our tracks. In the moonlight, there we saw what looked to be a huge bipedal horse stepping out from behind the piñon and into the moonlight. No, this can't be right, I thought. I've seen horses spar on nature documentaries, and I know they can kind of go up on their hindquarters to box each other out for dominance. But this thing, it was literally walking on its back legs like a person. It cocked its head to the side, and it looked right at us, with what can only be described as a creepy smile. Something about the creature just seemed evil. Its eyes didn't look like a horse's at all. They were more like beady little buttons, shiny and black. The creature was at least 10 feet tall, and the more we studied it, the more I could see that it really looked more like a person wearing a horse's head than an actual horse. But the legs were those of a horse, and I could even see a tail hanging down behind it. The torso looked more human too, with a strong chest and arms with human hands on them. I couldn't tell if it was wearing a pelt or if its skin was natural, but it had Navajo-style tattoos covering the chest and torso. It also appeared to be wearing some kind of turquoise jewelry around its neck and wrists. It huffed again and began walking towards us. We freaked out and ran as fast as we could away, but I ended up tripping. I turned around to see this horse-like creature lunging at me, trying to grab me with its creepy little hands. I tried to kick it off of me when it opened its mouth, and I could see what I can only describe as vampire fangs, which it tried to bite me with. I rolled to the side, and it snapped at the air. I threw some dirt in its face and sprinted back to my tent. "What the heck, man? Why did you leave me?" I asked my friend. "It doesn't matter. We need to get the heck out of here. Now!" We climbed into the truck, but the engine refused to turn over. In the headlights, we saw that thing stumble out in front of us, so we locked the doors. But it came right at us, ramming its head into the passenger side of the truck. We unlocked and opened the driver's side door, jumping out of the cab and running back to the tent, diving in, quickly zipping up the flap and hiding in our sleeping bags, like little kids afraid of the boogeyman. We heard that thing out there stomping around us, and we heard what sounded like chanting mixed with these strange animalistic growling noises. Just then, we heard a gunshot, and then galloping off in the distance. We still refused to exit the tent, even then, and stayed awake for fear that the creature would return. I must have fallen asleep at some point out of sheer exhaustion, because when I woke up, it was morning. We got out of our tent, and a short time later, we were approached by our Navajo host. I won't say his name out of respect for the culture. He told us we had angered a native spirit who was trying to drive us away from the land, but he was able to scare it off with a bullet dipped in ashes. After that, we decided it would be best to cut our trip short. I don't know if this creature was a skinwalker or something else. We didn't want to pry or ask too many questions, as it's very taboo to talk about these things in Navajo culture for fear of attracting their attention. But whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. Tree on the Hill. From Anonymous. When I was about 13 years old, my brothers and I would love to go into the woods in our backyard. We would play in our creek, stomping in the mud, and typical kid stuff. But one day, while I'd been jumping on our trampoline near the woods by myself, I decided I wanted to go into the creek. At the time, I didn't feel like going back to the house to get my brothers, so I literally just started walking into the woods alone. Once I got past the entrance to the woods, I saw a weird-looking tree. This tree was on a large mound of dirt and grass, so I had to climb up to it. As soon as I made it to the tree, I got this uneasy feeling. I felt that something had been watching me. I really don't have any idea why I did this, but I knocked on the tree 3 times. At first, I heard nothing in response. But after about 10 seconds, I heard a faint sound. Honestly, it sounded like a goblin and a chicken combined. It kind of sounded like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, but it was clucking like a chicken. I really didn't get it, especially since it was coming from inside the tree. I kept knocking on the tree in this manner. 3 knocks, then the noise would come. Then I heard scratching on the outside of the tree bark. This sounded like it was coming from the other side of the tree. I leaned to the side to peer at the back of the tree. All I saw was a hole that was so deep I couldn't see inside. I was so curious that I walked around the tree and just stared into the hole. My heart stopped when I heard the chicken goblin-sounding thing growl at me. I still continued to stare into the hole until a clawed hand reached out in my direction just inches from my face. Quickly, I stumbled down the hill, causing me to scrape my knee. I ignored it and ran up to my house. Quickly, I shut the door once I got back inside, and I peered out the window. I looked just in time to see this dog-like creature entering the woods once more. Whatever it was, it had followed me down. I don't think I could ever go in those woods again, mostly because I'd rather stay alive. The Wendigo of Alberta. From Anonymous. As a bit of background, I live in a small town in mid-eastern Alberta. My friends and I loved to go exploring when we were younger, around 13 to 14, but I can't remember exactly. What I do know is that it was in mid-January when we encountered this. I'd always go into the woods around my house with my friends, Greg and Jeff. One night while we were exploring down an old ATV trail near my house, which was now mostly used as a snowmobile trail, we were walking along trying not to slip on the ice. Around that time, I noticed something. The weather was beginning to get windy, and it was starting to snow. So we started discussing heading back to my house to play some video games instead. That's when we heard something behind us that sort of sounded like a low growl, underlaid with a human scream. Whatever it was, it scared the living crap out of us. As we began to walk away, out of fear of whatever that was, we heard a branch snap. That triggered us into running. As we ran away, we began to hear really loud stomping sounds behind us as if something was following us. Before long, the weather had gotten so bad we couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. We were now running half blinded by the weather, but suddenly the stomping sound stopped. Needing to catch our breaths, we slowed to a halt as well. When we were all stopped, we heard the growl again. This time it was much louder, and it was coming from in front of us. We stared in horror as this thing emerged in front of us. Some sort of creature that stood 9 to 10 feet tall with a human-like body. Its limbs were a little too long and bony though. It had clawed fingers and a head that resembled more of an elk. Maybe it was shock, but my first thought was that elk aren't exactly common out here. And as I was thinking that, I noticed the bone-like texture of its head. It was more like a skull. I wanted to scream and run, but I was frozen to the spot. The three of us all stood there, staring. The fear we felt was like a trance. I couldn't even move my eyes away from it. It was moving towards us, blocking the trail that led to the main road, and all we could do was either run the opposite way if our bodies allowed us, which would lead to a cabin, or run through the woods to my house. Making a split decision and praying my body would listen, I took off through the thick caragana bushes, a good 500 meters to my open yard, and my friends followed. We made it to my yard. The time was about 2 a.m., so no one else would be awake, and from there I wasn't sure if they'd hear us screaming at the front door to let us in. It didn't help that I'd told my parents that I was going to stay at Greg's house for the night. Luckily for us, I remembered the code for the door lock, or else we would have been screwed. Once we got in, we rushed inside and locked the door. I could then hear it running through the yard, then over to the living room bay window. I stood there, trying to look out the top of the window of the door, but also attempting to stay hidden. Suddenly, Jeff screamed from the living room. When I went to see what he was screeching about, he was looking out the window which overlooked the deck. He remained quiet after that. He stood there and silently pointed. When I followed his fingers, I saw that creature again. It was walking up the stairs to the deck. It went up them very awkwardly, as though it wasn't used to them. I wanted to scream then too, but before I could, I looked over at Jeff and noticed he was crying. That was odd. Jeff wasn't exactly the type of person who cried very often, or even when he was scared. But then I saw the cut on his shoulder. It was about 3 inches long and looked a bit deep. I was about to ask him when that happened, when that thing outside began to try to bust open the door, ramming into it with full force. We ran upstairs then, where my room and my parents' room were. I rushed over to my dad, telling him about the thing outside. He grabbed his rifle from the gun cabinet, then rushed downstairs while loading it. When he got to the front door, he looked out the window, just as that thing rammed the door again. It was loudly growling, baring its long carnivorous yellow teeth. My dad stood back and told us to hide. We listened and watched my dad aim his gun at the door. Within about a minute, though, the noises stopped. My dad then went outside, looking around. About 30 seconds later, he came back inside, locking the door. And that was the last I saw of that thing. Ever since, I've been horrified of the woods around that house. I'm 20 now and I've moved to Edmonton. I've not seen or heard of that creature again. But just in case, I never go back into the woods unarmed. but I still do enjoy the woods and hiking with friends. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.